Let's jump right into this. Have you ever stopped to think about how institutional power actually operates in the blind spots? Those gaps where literally no one is watching? Today, we're serving up a visual companion to a really vital essay from Thoughtless Delineation. We're going to step into a deeply systemic, forensic critique of algorithmic platforms and examine a very specific, invisible harm that's being produced by the exact same systems designed to keep us safe online. To start, we really need to look at this central paradox. Recently, GLAAD put out its 2026 Social Media Safety Index. And look, it's a rigorous, absolutely necessary report documenting how platforms, think Meta, YouTube, X, TikTok, are failing marginalized users. The report completely nails the mechanism at play here. Platforms are built to maximize engagement, right? So they amplify divisive content because that's what drives clicks. But at the same time, their automated moderation systems, which are trying to handle safety at a massive scale, they just default to this really conservative suppression. They flag anything coded as sensitive. So the result? You get platforms under-moderating actual hate, while at the exact same time over-moderating and suppressing legitimate identity disclosure. Now, the architecture here is very real, and GLAAD did a brilliant job documenting it, but here is the massive blind spot. Here's what the report cannot see. Adoptees actually experience this exact identical algorithmic architecture. The mechanism is exactly the same. However, because adoptees are completely absent from GLAAD's accountability framework, the institutional blindness just remains totally intact. And, when this kind of suppression happens without any institutional oversight, it's not just some technical glitch. It transforms into a highly specific, profound kind of harm. Let's break this down further in Section 1, the condition of anomie, the pain of disconnection. So the term anomie, it was originally coined by the sociologist Emil Durkheim, and it's actually not just about confusion or simple loss. Surprisingly, anomie doesn't happen when there are simply zero rules. It happens when the rules of society fundamentally stop making sense. It's the psychological devastation of living in a world where the very structures that were supposed to give your life meaning have just completely collapsed. It is this incredibly specific pain of disconnection, disconnected from purpose, from community, from the basic possibility that your life can cohere. Basically, anomie kicks in when the world stops making sense, but you are still held responsible for making sense of it anyway. And adoptees, they know this condition intimately. If we use honest adoption language, this is described as the fifth-dimensional split. It is the literal experience of living across two asynchronous signals. On one hand, you're severed from your biological origin, right? You're constructed from absence just as much as presence. But on the other hand, you are handed this adoptive family narrative that basically says, hey, you belong here now, your original family is irrelevant. But your body knows differently. That adoptive narrative just does not cohere with your subsonic truth. And for decades, the adoption industry has maintained this state of anomie, basically telling adoptees that this forced coherence was the only option available. Which brings us to Section 2, where adoptees live, algorithmic suppression. Let's map exactly where this suppression occurs in the digital spaces where adoptees actually live. Take genealogy and DNA platforms like Ancestry or 23andMe. The algorithms there treat adoptee searches as inherently risky, so they default to restrictive settings and they suppress or delay matches. The institutional logic claims this is all about protection, but the real-world outcome, it's the absolute erasure of biological truth. Then you look at mainstream platforms like Meta or TikTok. Their algorithms literally can't distinguish between identity disclosure and exploitation risk, so they just hit the default switch, suppression. Adoptees who are just posting about searching for biological relatives often find their content shadowbanned or age-gated out of nowhere. Even in small, dedicated adoption forums, content gets flagged and accounts get suspended. The algorithmic logic is identical across the board, but because zero institutional oversight reaches these specific spaces, this erasure is happening completely in the dark. Moving into Section 3, the production of anomie, institutional blindness. Here is exactly why this lack of recognition is so utterly devastating. When LGBTQ+ identity is suppressed, it's a measurable injustice, right? Because it's a recognized protected category. So when platforms suppress it, advocacy groups like GLAAD can actually measure the harm, protest it, and demand real policy changes. But adoptees? They simply do not have this. Imagine experiencing algorithmic erasure, but having no census box, no protected category, and literally no institutional language to even call it what it is. When an algorithm suppresses an adoptee searching for their biological truth, there is no framework that calls that suppression. Instead, it's just dismissed as a neutral privacy issue or a data security matter. So the adoptee is left entirely alone with their erasure, unable to name it and unable to protest it. This intense isolation, that is the production of anomie at an institutional scale. Let's look at why this happens in Section 4, Structural Blindness Framework Limitations. Now, it is really important to clarify that this isn't some failure of GLAAD, and it's certainly not personal malice. What we're looking at here is non-adoptee bias operating as structural blindness. You see, accountability frameworks completely rely on scope and metrics. GLAAD's 14 indicators are built entirely around one recognized protected category. But every scope has an edge, and adoptees just happen to fall outside of it. The ecosystem that's currently watching for algorithmic harm literally cannot see the harm being done to adoptees, simply because adoptee identity hasn't been built into the framework yet. Which takes us to the historical context. Section 5, the architecture of silence, version 2.0. So for about 70 years, Phase 1 relied on this architecture of silence. We're talking sealed records, amended birth certificates, strict legal prohibitions. It was all paper and policy. Then, in Phase 2, DNA testing came along and completely changed the game. Adoptees were able to bypass the gatekeepers, find their biological relatives, and start building real communities. But as those communities grew, the institutions adapted. And that brings us to Phase 3 today. Now, platforms manage access not through legislation, but through the highly opaque machinery of content moderation and data governance.
The gravity of this shift absolutely cannot be overstated. The outcome today is identical to the old days of sealed paper files. Biological truth is suppressed, adoptees are isolated, and the possibility of coherence is artificially constrained. The mechanism itself has just changed from sealed records to algorithmic opacity. And because this opacity is neatly framed as a technical problem, just balancing privacy and safety, it entirely escapes political accountability. This is literally the architecture of silence, rebuilt in code.
I want to dwell on this quote for a second because it's so powerful. The gap in oversight is itself a form of power. Think about that. If respected organizations can't even see the suppression, who exactly is holding these platforms accountable? If groups documenting algorithmic harm cannot see adoptee erasure, the platforms know for a fact that they're operating in a space of complete institutional blindness. And that means the adoption industry has effectively won the ability to keep suppressing biological truth using brand new tools, while remaining entirely invisible to the accountability structures that are supposed to constrain them. But this isn't where the story ends. Section 6, the post-tragic turn, agency of recognition. We really don't have to stay in this silence. There is immense, undeniable agency in simply naming this dynamic. GLAAD has already proven that institutional oversight absolutely works. Documenting bias creates real, measurable pressure on platforms to change. So if we can just recognize that adoptee identity suppression is operating through the exact same mechanism GLAAD has already named, well, we can expand those frameworks. By naming the structural blindness, we pull it into the light. We create the conditions for adoptees to finally have their suppression measured and addressed. Anomie is not some personal failure. It's an engineered social condition. And because it's engineered, it can absolutely be dismantled. The institutional blindness has been named. The gap in oversight is finally visible. So the question now isn't whether accountability frameworks should expand, it's whether the adoption industry will be allowed to just continue operating in the spaces where no one is watching. What we do with this visibility is entirely up to us. To dive deeper into the systemic critique, I highly encourage you to go read the full essay on the Thoughtless Delineation Substack. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the frameworks, and I'll catch you in the next one.